Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. I was last here on the day that I announced my candidacy for Attorney General, my first time in the Cumberland Public Library. And I've been telling everybody this is the best public library in the state. There's really no question. I've also been saying to my wife, why don't we move to Cumberland? But I don't know if that's going to happen. I would like it very much. Thank you again for having me tonight. My name is Keith Hoffmann. I'm running for Attorney General because I believe I have the energy and the ability and the experience needed to tackle a lot of the challenges that we're facing in our state at this time. And there are a lot of significant challenges, from healthcare to public safety to federal overreach harming our communities. The Attorney General's office has an important role to play in all of those areas. Now, many of you, all of you, know what the Attorney General's office does. And a core part of our mission is public safety. We prosecute 4,000 felonies a year, thousands of criminal cases every year in Rhode Island. That's essential work. Essential work. We've got to keep you safe. And I will keep you safe, but there is so much more that we have to do from the Attorney General's office to make sure that you are safe in your community. We have to make sure that you have access to healthcare. We have to make sure that our environment is protected. We have to make sure that the federal government doesn't harm our state budget and our rights. And those are all critical areas for the Attorney General's office today, and they're all areas that I've been working on under Attorney General Arona now for a number of years. But before I get into that, I can tell you a little bit about myself, if that sounds good. All right, we'll start there. So I grew up in Portsmouth. I was born at the Newport Labor and Delivery Center, which some of you might have read. They almost just shut down because of budget cuts. And I grew up in Portsmouth at a time when, the Portsmouth Public Library that I went to growing up, you could go there as a kid, and I would go there with my brother and sister in the afternoon, and the federal government was providing it a lot of money and support through this federal library agency. And if somebody was polluting the bay, the EPA would be there to help clean it up because we could rely on our federal government in the late 80s and 90s. Good days. But today, it's a different circumstance, isn't it? The Trump administration, one of the first actions that they took when they came into office was to gut that federal library agency and try to cut funding to libraries across the country, including in Rhode Island. And we fought that action from the Attorney General's office in a case called Rhode Island v. Trump, and we won. And I remember thinking at that moment, as we were just building that case and filing in court here, and just back to my time at the Portsmouth Public Library growing up, and how the federal government didn't really seem to be caring about our families or our children too much anymore, or thinking about them too much anymore, as they took these really reckless decisions. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I haven't grown up yet in my story, because before I worked in the Attorney General's office, I did some things. In fact, when I was 13, something sad happened to my family. My father had been a doctor who served in the Vietnam War, and my mom was a teacher for many years at Salvation. She was ultimately the chair of the Criminal Justice Department there for a number of years. And my dad got cancer linked to Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam. He passed away when I was 13. And it was bad. It was a bad experience all around. But there was one good thing that came out of it, which was that my mom was chair of her department. She had 3 teenagers alone. And these families in our community came together to sort of help finish the job of raising me and my brother and sister. And what I learned from that experience is that when you get knocked down, your community can be there to help build you back up. And I think that we are all in this state, to a greater or lesser degree, facing significant challenges. And I think that as Rhode Islanders, we're going to need to come together to fight back and make sure that our communities can be safe going forward. So with my community around me, I got back up. I went off to college at the University of Pennsylvania. I met my wife there. I was a freshman. She was a much older sophomore, who I convinced to date me. The hardest thing I've ever done until running for Attorney General. She wanted to go into medicine. I always wanted to go into public service. And so when she went off to medical school, I went to Fordham Law School in New York. She was at NYU Medical School. And I did all government and public interest work. And when she got including in the Attorney General's office here, and when she went to residency in New York for another few years, I stayed in New York with her, and I got a fellowship sponsored by a big law firm there to help people get access to healthcare and housing. And then I stayed on for a couple more years and led a team of lawyers doing that work. And then she finished her residency, and it was time to decide where we would live. And Rachel, my wife, is not from Rhode Island, although she'd been coming here since she was 19, since we started dating. And she likes to joke that when you're born in Rhode Island, there's a homing beacon implanted in you. And so she actually was kind enough to suggest, why don't we move to Rhode Island? I said, yeah, let's do it. She said, maybe your mom would live nearby and help out with our grandkids, with our kids. I said, we're going to have kids. And it's all turned out basically the way that Rachel planned. My mom moved up from Quinnipiac Island. She lives down the street from us in Providence now. So when I came back to Rhode Island, I started to work in the Attorney General's office under the last AG, Cumberland. And since that time, I've done many, many things in the Attorney General's office. I helped to build what we call our Public Protection Bureau that does all of our healthcare and environmental and consumer protection and civil rights work, I was cross-designated as a criminal prosecutor for a number of years. I became a unit chief, and then I moved up to the executive team under Attorney General Nerona, was his chief of policy and senior counsel, working on, to help to run the office, craft our budget, but also on the biggest cases, some of the biggest cases that came before our office. And it was in that role in about April 2024, that AG Nerona and I were talking about what would happen if there was a second Trump administration. And what we knew at a basic level, having looked at Project 2025 and some of these administration tweets that were coming out, is that it would be devastating to our state and its budget. Because what the Trump administration was really planning to do through Project 2025, at least, was gut state funding, right? In ways that were unlawful, because Congress's job is to appropriate funding, our taxpayer dollars, and send it back to the states in ways that the president has to just execute on what the Congress tells him to do. But they weren't planning to do that. And so we started to get prepared. And so I was put in charge of preparing that fight. And then after the election, we clearly hoped that we could throw all those memos away and all those legal complaints that we drafted away. But after the election, it didn't come to that. We all went down to Philadelphia, the attorneys general and their senior staff, and we talked about what we would do to fight back. And after the inauguration, we put that into practice. Why did we do it? This isn't about policy differences. It's not even really about politics. It's about illegal action by the federal government. And I'll give you an example of one case that actually impacted Cumberland as it did municipalities around the state. Within about a week of taking office, the president, and it really wasn't the president, it was Elon Musk, cut all state funding. $5 billion worth of state funding was cut off. So state workers were going into the Medicaid portal or the infrastructure, some federal grant for transportation infrastructure program, going into those payment portals, and they were trying to draw down funds for projects that needed funding right now, and they couldn't do it. And the state doesn't have the ability to draw down a bond quickly enough to cover those shortfalls. And so we were in a really, really dangerous situation. So what did we do? Well, fortunately, Musk had tweeted about this, right? And we were prepared. We had a complaint drafted. We went to federal court here in Rhode Island. We got an injunction. A judge told the government to stop. The Trump administration has followed that order. And it's held up on appeal, and it will hold up on appeal, as many of these cases, if not, in fact, almost all of these cases have, because what we're dealing with is completely unlawful conduct. That the United States Supreme Court, as much as I disagree with many of their decisions, they are not willing to allow this president, in many cases, to completely break the law. And so that was one aspect of work that I did in the AG's office, fighting Trump. But there's so much more critical work that the Attorney General's office does that will be made more difficult, as it will, I think, in other, frankly, many of you are in government, and we know that our jobs are going to be made a little bit more difficult. So I talked about the EPA, right, when I was a kid, how they would stand up to polluters. They're not going to do that work anymore. And so if we want to see that work get done, it's going to happen out of the Department of Environmental Management and the Attorney General's office. We've been doing that work for years. We're going to have to be prepared to do it going forward. Scammers. It used to be that we could rely on the Federal Trade Commission to help us out with that work at the federal level. In fact, they did most of it. They're not prioritizing that work anymore. If we want to see that get done, it's going to be out of the Attorney General's office. I helped to build our consumer protection work out of our office. Public safety. When I'm Attorney General, we are going to partner with our federal agencies to make sure that criminals are prosecuted. I want to do that more. The ATF, the FBI, the DEA, we need them to help us prosecute serious crime. Right now, the president is asking them to spend 25% of their time on civil immigration enforcement instead of going after violent offenders. That doesn't make sense. So if we're going to go after gun runners and human traffickers to make sure Rhode Islanders are safe, we're going to need to do more of that work out of the office that we've built. Now, fortunately, under Attorney General Rona, we have built a very, very strong office. This Attorney General's office, I think, is as strong as it's ever been. And it's been truly an honor to help to build that under Attorney General Rona. And I'm proud that he's endorsed me in this race. But we've got our work cut out for us. And I think that if we come together and fight together for our communities, we're going to be able to get through it. And I ask for your support in doing just that. So would love to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
I'll ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Solomon as well.
I stepped away for a moment.
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to repeat it. I wasn't going to make you memorize it. And I asked the candidate who was here at the last meeting as well. For me, when I think about the Attorney General's office and the issues and policies that they touch frequently, one of the things that's most important to me is domestic violence and domestic violence advocacy and support for survivors experiencing that. So my question is basically, what do you think that we're doing well in Rhode Island right now to support domestic violence survivors? And what do you think you would advocate for to enhance or add or improve upon?
It's a really important question. What are we doing well? At Attorney General's office, I think we're doing some things well. For example, we created a special victims unit under Attorney General Rona that focuses mainly on domestic violence and sexual abuse cases. That's important. It's important to have people that specialize in that sort of work in a trauma-informed way. The caseloads are too high. Average caseload of 200 cases a prosecutor. It's too high. I've advocated for additional resources for that unit to make sure that it can do its critical work. In terms of services, look, Day One does a fantastic job. They are really building into an even stronger organization right now. Their job has also been made more challenging by federal cuts. The federal government, one of the things that they did just recently that you might have seen is condition the receipt of federal funds on not saying a list essentially of naughty words that they consider naughty. And that really hurt organizations that provide services to survivors. We're going to, well, in fact, we did fight that.
I was going to say,
we absolutely. Yeah. We filed a lawsuit, and then our lawsuit had to be a little bit narrow because it could only apply to state funding. But a bunch of nonprofits, including the coalition, came together to fight that also in Rhode Island courts, which was very important. They're going to win that lawsuit. I mean, you can't condition the receipt of federal funding on protected speech. Essentially, it's ridiculous. But that's the sort of thing that this federal government is trying to do. So it's such an important area. You know, shortly the diocese report is going to be released by the Attorney General's office that it's not specifically about domestic violence, it's about child sexual abuse, frankly. You know, but our victims, our most vulnerable victims, whether they're survivors of domestic violence or sexual abuse, are some of the most challenging cases that we'll have because the trauma that they experience is so significant and they do need additional services. Oh, one other good thing that we do that I think that we can do, we could potentially do more of or better. We have victim advocates in the Attorney General's office that are phenomenal. The victim advocates will often be paired with, these are not prosecutors. These are people who support victims during their journey through the court system. Being a crime victim in the courts can be really traumatizing. You have to relive that experience over and over again. And the victim advocates can be there for those folks as day one can be as well. I think that our victim advocates are fantastic. They are also overburdened. And so, look, this isn't always about getting more FTEs, right, for the Attorney General's office. One of the things that we would do when I was there was somebody would retire, a file clerk, and we would sit around a table with senior staff and we'd say, okay, we now have an FTE. Should it stay in that unit or does it go somewhere else? Does it go to a new victim advocate? Does it go to a new prosecutor for our special victims unit? Does it go toward environmental protection? And there would be sometimes some raised voices in those rooms. And that's good because you want this office to be run efficiently and effectively. And that means using every single one of our more than 260 FTEs in the place where it can have the biggest impact.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
I was going to say, do you want to go in order? You go.
Same question I asked Mr. Solomon, spent on gun control, specifically ghost guns, assault weapon ban.
Sure.
And you and I touched briefly, that's why I asked if people would take any money from the NRA and political contributions, and
I can't imagine the NRA would want to give me money.
well,
But no.
88% of the contributions from the NRA go to Republican candidates. They also have donated $166 million from 2020 to 2024. So while they are not generating money directly, like writing a check, they're using those dark money PACs.
Right.
Would you take money from their PACs?
I would not. I would not take money from their PAC. And you know, I'm also not taking money, for example, from Meta or Amazon, some of these big corporate actors that we've had to file a lot of lawsuits against because they are such bad, frankly, actors and poisoning, in my view, our children's minds with some of their algorithms. Look, I think that gun safety is a really important issue. I grew up shooting guns. My dad was a vet. A lot of his family members liked shooting. One of them actually competed for the military in the Vietnam era. He didn't end up going to Vietnam because he was competing in competitions for the military. Good deal. And you know, I think that when I was shooting guns as a kid, it was like like 22s. I think that these firearms that we're talking about today are very different. I went to the range with some of the our BCI officers at the Attorney General's office to shoot an AR-15 just to see what it was like. It's terrifying. I mean, these firearms are so easy and so lethal. I have a real concern about those firearms in the wrong hands. Look, firearm policy is driven primarily by the legislature in this state. The AG's job is to defend those laws. We'll advise from the Attorney General's office, the legislature, on how to make a constitutional law. That's really important. The Supreme Court has given us a new standard for how we look at gun safety regulation, common sense gun safety regulation. We got to follow that decision, Bruin, whether we like it or not. And it's really important that when the legislature passes gun safety measures, they're constitutional. The AG's office will certainly advise in those areas. Generally, though, it's the legislature that makes the firearm policy for this state. You asked about ghost guns. I mean, look, if people are breaking the law with guns, we're going to prosecute them aggressively. Gun running, ghost guns. I mean, you cannot take your foot off the gas, I think, with violent crime and violent crime prevention. Because when you're prosecuting a firearm offense, you know, really what you're doing is you're preventing somebody from murdering somebody down the stretch. I think that that's really important. So, does that answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Your stance on Roe versus Wade.
Roe versus Wade. So look, Roe v. Wade was the law for a very long time. I think it was correctly decided. The Dobbs decision, I think, is an incorrect decision. I think it's very important that women have a right to choose what they do with their bodies. In Rhode Island, we codified Roe, right, several years ago. So that's through field liability. I think that it's remarkable. I think it was remarkably prescient. I think it was very, very smart that our legislature decided to do that in advance of Dobbs being overturned. I knew people suggested that they might, that Roe being overturned in Dobbs. People suggested that they might overturn Roe, and then they did it. And I think that you've seen a backlash across this country, including in traditionally conservative states, where people are saying, we didn't think that they would do it. We thought that this was sort of settled law, and some political backlash there. So, look, I think Roe v. Wade was for two generations an incredibly important decision. I think it's heartbreaking what's happening. I'll tell you just a quick story. I would sometimes go on trips for A.G. Nerona, who famously hates to travel. For those of you who don't know, he likes to stay at home in Rhode Island, as do I, but I worked for him, so sometimes I had to go. So there was a trip for AG's to Texas. And we were going to Texas in part to go to a women's health center. So we went to this women's health center. I'm there with this group of AGs who are pretty, AGs are pretty hard people, right? They're lawyers, they're pretty serious. And we heard from women who had experienced what it's like to live in a state like Texas where they don't have access to reproductive health care anymore. There was a woman who had miscarried, was in the process of miscarrying. She went to her doctor in Texas and they wouldn't treat her because the treatment would have been an abortion, but she was miscarrying, right? The fetus was not going to live, but they still wouldn't treat her. So she had to get onto a plane while she was bleeding in order to get health care, I think in Chicago. Devastating. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Not a dry eye in the house. So we need to stand up for Rhode Island women. We need to defend those laws. This is what's really important. The AG's office on some of these bigger issues, these constitutional issues, gun safety, access to abortions, we don't drive policy. We prosecute cases, we sue the federal government, we go after polluters, we go after corporate wrongdoing. We aren't generally driving this policy. That's the General Assembly. But we defend these laws. That's very important. You want to make sure you elect an attorney general who's going to defend the laws that you pass. That's essential. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for centering women in that story. You mentioned Project 2025, and I know it was hot topic during the election. I don't know that many people actually read it. I found that, I found that it was particularly horrifying, the line that ran through it, Roe v. Wade becomes almost unimportant at the level that they're trying to attack women's rights, targeting single mothers, taking away protections around divorce that could take women that are in a bad situation, force them to stay in that situation. And it was so pervasive. And I think one of the ways we're seeing it come to life right now is the attack on voting rights. So I know you're prepared based on everything you said to us, in terms of your belief that we need to fight to protect something like that. But are you already working on avenues that you guys would fight if they're interfering with the midterm elections, say?
Yeah. So for those of you who didn't read all 1,000 pages of Project 2025, let me first agree. It's a very, very devastating and sort of dystopian, bad policy document. What they're doing is more extreme. So when we went out there, when Democrats went out there and talked to independents and conservatives during 2024, and we said, look, there's this document 2025 that's going to be their playbook, and they said, we don't believe you. They wouldn't do that stuff. In fact, they went more hard, right? They put their foot on the gas, and some of the things that they're doing are not even contemplated in Project 2025. Vaccine access, for example, they're trying to reduce children's access to vaccines. What are they thinking? That's not contemplated in Project 2025. It's just one example of something they tried to do last week, and we sued them over it, fortunately. So look, access to the ballot box, it's essential. That used to be a bipartisan issue. That changed in 2020. So in 2020, I got a call from a former high-ranking government official who was now a whistleblower. And he said, look, here's what they're going to do. Well, actually, he first said, I don't live in Rhode Island, but I know a Rhode Islander. Let me tell you about her. And do you know her? And I did, because it's Rhode Island. And so he went on to tell us how they were going to try to steal the election. This person called each state, and we got together to talk about how we're going to fight back. The basic idea was that they were going to try to pull, as they did, the election of 1873, throw the Electoral College into disarray, and steal the election. And so how were we going to fight back against it? Well, it was going to be with a series of court cases to protect the ballot and ballot access. And then it was going to be to run the most perfect election that you could possibly run during COVID so that nobody could conceivably challenge it. And so that's what we did in Rhode Island. And I think we did it well. We kept all of our polling locations open. We brought a case up to the United States Supreme Court to make sure that people had access to mail ballots. It was a phenomenally, I think, well-run, and to Cindy's point about collaboration, a phenomenal collaboration between the Attorney General's office, the Board of Elections, and the Secretary of State's office. And I led that effort from the Attorney General's office. They're going to do it again, but they're going to do it in new ways, in different ways, and now they're not even pretending that they care. In the midterms, look, there's only so much you can mess with a midterm election because there's not an electoral college. What are the things that they're going to try to do? They might try to intimidate voters. Well, fortunately, Americans, if you try to intimidate them, are more likely to vote. So we've got that going for us. But they might try to intimidate people in certain marginalized groups, right? We've got to make sure that people feel protected going to the voting booth. What else might they try to do? They might try to institute nationwide voter ID, right? The SAFE Act. That would be really problematic. I don't think that bill is going to pass. In Rhode Island, we have voter ID. We have to make sure the voter ID is implemented fairly and protects people's right to vote. We've trained poll workers from the Attorney General's office on making sure that that's the voter ID laws in Rhode Island don't interfere with people's right to vote. We have a solid system of provisional ballot voting here that ensures that, for example, if somebody changes their name, they're still going to be able to vote, even if they can't prove their identity at the time. But we have to make sure that those folks can get their ballot counted. This is exactly the sort of thing that we have to be prepared for, that those sort of like fights for democracy and for our state, while we do everything else. The 4,000 felonies, we're going to prosecute them. We have to do that. The defense of the state. We haven't talked about this. The Attorney General's office defends the state in billions of dollars worth of litigation. We have to do that. We have to do that. And there's now this whole new area of work that we have to do. And it's okay because we're prepared for it. We've got a phenomenally good team. But we're just going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time as they say to make sure it all gets done. Yep.
Just to briefly follow up on that, because now we're talking about voter ID laws, with the news coming out of Kansas that hundreds of trans individuals have had their driver's license revoked basically overnight.
Yep.
And now kind of the push from the federal government for stricter voter ID laws. How do you think that states can protect the rights of trans individuals in these increasingly challenging times when they already face undue burden at the ballot box to begin with? Yeah,
well, so I think that trans individuals are absolutely one of the groups that they're going to be trying to target in the context of like a SAVE Act, right? Trying to make it more difficult for people who've changed their name to access the ballot. What do we need to do here in Rhode Island or nationally?
Yeah, just overall, what can states do to kind of try to safeguard those rights?
Yeah, so a lot of it in Rhode Island with our particular voter ID law, you have to make sure that poll workers are trained. We've watched this very closely. People have been able to vote in this state because the poll workers are well trained and they know what to do. And we again have that provisional balloting structure. But if you're in a state where really the voter ID requirement is a fig leaf for discrimination, like in Kansas potentially, that's hugely problematic. And one of the things that I've been thinking about with some others is, well, Rhode Island has a pretty direct stake in the outcome of the Kansas election, doesn't it? If the Kansas election, just as an example, is not a fair election, that harms Rhode Island, right? We're a part of the same country. And what do we need to be doing to make sure that all those elections are conducted fairly? So we've done some of this work, for example, in 2020, when it was the Trump, it was the Trump campaign actually, trying to overturn the results in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia. We got involved in those fights. We've tended not to get as involved in things like what you're describing in Kansas. But the truth is that I think the fight for democracy in this country is sort of a bedrock thing that we're probably going to need to be more engaged in as democratic states that seem at this point to be the states that are most firmly committed to just democracy. I do think that right now what we're seeing from the federal government, not every person serving the federal government, of course, but from many at the highest levels, is a tilt toward authoritarianism. And that's a significant risk to all of us. You sit here in a library and it feels just like when I was a kid, sitting in the Portsmouth Public Library. But there's something out there happening that is very, very, very dangerous. And we need to be on guard against it. We need to fight back against it when we can.
Thank you.
Yep.
Can you expand a little bit more about your experience in the courtroom?
Sure. So let's see. I started off as a lawyer, as a young lawyer, going to court for actually some of my earliest court cases were before veteran appeal boards, helping people appeal their discharge upgrades, like survivors of sexual assault in the military who then had a mental health issue, got discharged, and needed somebody to represent them to help them get access to healthcare. But I've represented people in court throughout my career. When I came into the Attorney General's office, I started as a civil litigator, appearing in court on behalf of the state, sometimes defending the state. For example, in the tolling, remember the tolls case? So I defended that case, and we had that case, of course, that case ended up being tried in federal court. Then I would appear in court on behalf of the state when we were on offense, right? When we were doing an enforcement action in a number of different cases against either bad corporate actors or polluters, landlords when a child has been lead poisoned, things like that. Then I was, as I mentioned, cross-designated as a criminal prosecutor and would appear in court to prosecute mainly hate crimes. I also did work on some other criminal matters when I was on the executive team. As I sort of moved up to the senior leadership levels of the office, I would still appear in court occasionally. I appeared in court on a couple of the Trump matters. But as you move up as a lawyer, generally you're sort of in a more supervisory role, overseeing others who appear. Peter hasn't really appeared in court at all, actually, in the last as Attorney General. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have mine.
Yes, Mayor.
I've asked all the other candidates. So there were a couple instances where Attorney General Cumberland opined, I guess, on some matters. The ILO case, I think there was another one, but it escapes me right now. And it was a big, if you listen to talk radio, which here and there I listen to it, it was kind of a big point of contention on at least one of the shows. So clearly there was no illegality found, but the Attorney General opined on the matter anyway. So, in your mind, is that appropriate for the Attorney General or not?
When you asked other people, I was away when Joe was answering. Do people know? Does everyone in the audience know what the ILO?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I don't think it's quite right to say that there was no wrongdoing. I think that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute a case. What ILO, and look, this wasn't the AG or the AG's office establishing something we're not. This was the state police. The state police instituted an investigation, published their own report, wanted to release that report, and the Attorney General's office also did a report. So that's sort of the cadence. I think that's important because the state police is a different agency, and that's by design, right? This is this is good government. The Attorney General's office is separate from the governor by design for this reason, so that we can independently investigate matters. But the state police do fall under the governor, and they were the ones that investigated that case. So look, with ILO, what I think was established was that by the state police and by the AG report was that a contract was steered toward somebody who was a friend of a political figure. That now would be unlawful, right? The General Assembly passed a law last legislative session to make bid rigging unlawful. And I think that's important. I think most other states or many other states already had that law in the books. In Rhode Island, because we didn't have that law in the books, there was insufficient evidence to establish corruption, right? So under those circumstances where you do find that rules were broken, right? This wasn't above board. I think it's very appropriate in cases of heightened public interest to issue a report. And that's something that happens around the country. It's something that happens at the federal level too. I think that some people thought in the ILO circumstance, well, there wasn't an indictment or there wasn't a conviction, and so we ought not to see the evidence. Well, first of all, the evidence was going to get apparent, and it was going to get out there. That was going to happen. So you might as well put it in context for people. And second of all, again, this wasn't a situation where nobody did anything wrong at all. In fact, I think the public did have an interest in understanding what happened in that circumstance. So look, I think that the guiding principle here is actually, there are many people who are probably very familiar with government here and the APRA, right? The APRA, the Access to Public Records Act. And that's to some extent how you might view these cases. And why is it that the APRA is helpful to us? Because the APRA tells us that where there's a significant public interest in a matter, significant public interest in a matter, it's more likely that we're going to release a record. And it's very similar in a case like ILO, where, there is this significant public interest. There was a huge amount of attention on that case well before the state police or AG investigations were known. To say to the public, all right, and not release anything would frankly make people think that everybody is in on something. And so I think that actually clarified things for the public, explained why there was no criminal prosecution, explained why there was no grand jury. Does that answer the question? So, yep, good. All right.
I think she wanted to follow up with you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I have no legal authority.
Yeah.
I have the same question for Rep. Solomon afterwards. I'm just saying about it now. But so as I'm sure you know, Rhode Island has some of the highest number of individuals on probation. What would you, how would you balance criminal reform with public safety?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the reasons for the high probation rates are complicated. That is, there are a lot of reasons why plea bargains are struck and then approved by judges with long probationary periods. I think that at a basic level, we do need more services for people who are coming out, who are either on probation or parole. I think that is very, very important. Do I think it is that the lengthy probation periods are necessarily a symptom of a system that's gone astray or something like this? I I don't think that I'm prepared to say that. And the reason why is that often a judge will approve a plea with a long probationary period because they don't want to give as long of a sentence. And so, what I do think is really important is that when somebody is not incarcerated, parole or probation, that we provide them the services that they need to reintegrate in society. We don't do as good of a job at that at the state level as we do at the federal level. There are some things that we can do, I think, better there for our population of people that are on probation or parole.
Anyone else? All right.
All right. Thanks so much.